Elijah Marsh was a beloved pastor. Miriam Marsh was his loyal wife. Leah Marsh was their obedient daughter. And Jonas Blake was the only one who suspected the truth. Behind the church doors and beneath the prayers, a horrifying secret was growing. One so twisted it would end in murder, betrayal, and a shocking ritual disguised as love. What began as whispers in the pews exploded into a nightmare no one in Eldridge could have imagined. This is the story of how a father broke every sacred vow, killed his own family to cover the truth, and died 3 days later in the most chilling way possible. In the heart of a small southern town called Eldridge stood a modest white chapel, crowned with a rusted bell and surrounded by weeping willows. Every Sunday, the townspeople gathered there, dressed in their finest, to hear the voice of Pastor Elijah Marsh. With his silver hair combed back neatly, a Bible always in his hand, and a smile that seemed carved into stone, Elijah was a man they trusted without question. His sermons moved people to tears, his prayers made them feel safe, and his charity work only added to his flawless reputation. But perfection often hides the deepest flaws. The Marsh family lived in a beautiful 2-story brick house, not far from the church. It had green shutters, white picket fences, and a front porch swing that creaked softly in the wind. It was the kind of house you'd see in a picture frame labeled "Home Sweet Home." Elijah's wife, Miriam, was the picture of grace and devotion. Always by his side, she cooked for the church, led prayer circles, and spoke kindly to everyone she met. Their daughter, Leah, was quiet and gentle. At 17, she was known for her soft eyes, love for poetry, and the way she sat in the front pew, taking careful notes during every sermon. To outsiders, they were the ideal Christian family. People said they were blessed, that God had placed his hand directly upon them. They never argued in public. They hosted church dinners in their backyard. Leah played hymns on the piano every Saturday evening. Their lives appeared so orderly, so perfect, so untouched by the chaos of the world. But beneath the surface, something felt. There were subtle signs, the kind that make sense only when looking back. Leah rarely spoke unless spoken to. Her eyes seemed duller with each passing month. She had once been a bubbly child, but now she moved through life like a shadow, always just behind her mother or alone in her room. Neighbors chalked it up to teenage moodiness. Miriam, when asked, would smile too quickly and say Leah was just going through a quiet season. And then there was Elijah's study. No one was allowed in the study except for Elijah himself. The door remained locked day and night. He claimed it was where he communed with God, wrote his sermons, and reflected in solitude. Even Miriam, as devoted as she was, had never stepped foot in there. The Lord speaks to him privately, she once explained with a nervous laugh, as if unsure whether she believed it herself. At church, Elijah was the same charismatic leader he'd always been. But Jonas Blake, his assistant pastor, began to notice odd behaviors. Elijah would arrive at strange hours, sometimes staying late into the night. Once Jonas found the pastor pacing in the sanctuary at 3, whispering scripture under his breath, and staring at the stained glass image of Mary with a strange, almost desperate expression. When Jonas called out to him, Elijah didn't even flinch. He just kept whispering. The townspeople didn't ask questions. They saw what they wanted to see, a man of God doing God's work. But the whispers were beginning. Quiet, nervous voices passing through grocery store aisles and after church potlucks. Leah had been missing school. Miriam seemed thinner, and Elijah had started preaching about spiritual cleansing and divine unions, messages that felt more cryptic than comforting. Still, no one confronted him. No one dared. It was unthinkable to question Elijah Marsh. He had buried their dead, baptized their babies, and married their children. To suspect him of anything dark or sinful felt like doubting God himself. But the truth was growing, swelling like a bruise beneath flawless skin, and soon the surface would split open. Leah Marsh had always moved through life with quiet obedience. She was the kind of girl who didn't raise her voice, who smiled politely and who folded her hands when spoken to. In Eldridge, people admired her for her modesty, her gentle manner, and her unwavering presence at church. But over time, there was something different about her, a hollowness in her eyes that words couldn't explain. Her steps grew slower, her smiles more mechanical. Her face, once warm and full of light, now looked like it had forgotten what joy felt like. Then, one summer morning, Leah fainted during choir practice. The choir director panicked, thinking she hadn't eaten. A few of the older women rushed to her side, and Elijah appeared from his office before anyone had a chance to call Miriam. He carried Leah out of the church himself, not letting anyone else touch her, whispering that she was just tired, that she'd been fasting and praying too much. That was the story. He insisted she rest at home for a while, and after that, she stopped showing up at church altogether. No one saw her for weeks. Rumors spread quietly through the congregation, but they were always gentle, always respectful. No one dared say anything unkind about the pastor's daughter. She's sick, some whispered. Maybe depression, others guessed. A few dared to say she might be pregnant, but the idea died quickly. Leah never dated, never even spoke to boys. She had no friends outside of church. The notion was too outrageous to believe, except it was true. Leah was pregnant, and no one knew who the father was. Miriam did her best to hide it. She stopped letting anyone into the house. She turned down all invitations. Even her closest friends noticed she stopped making eye contact during conversations. There was a trembling in her hands, a stiffness in her speech. People noticed, but they didn't question it too deeply. In Eldridge, privacy and reputation went hand in hand. At first, Miriam believed it had to be a mistake, a horrible misunderstanding. Leah must have been attacked by a stranger, or maybe someone from the church. Her heart broke as she tried to pull the truth from her daughter's lips, but Leah stayed silent. She stared through her mother as if she were sleepwalking. She wouldn't name anyone, wouldn't even cry. That silence, unshakable and heavy, was what finally shattered Miriam's faith in her husband. There had been small signs before, long glances from Elijah toward Leah, the late-night prayer sessions, the locked door, the bruises Miriam once assumed were accidents. But now, a darker picture began to take shape in her mind, one she couldn't admit out loud. She watched Elijah more closely now. She listened to the way he spoke to Leah, the way he hovered over her like a possessive shadow. There was something not just wrong, but evil, and Elijah had changed. His sermons grew stranger, laced with twisted metaphors about purity, divine bloodlines, and sanctified suffering. He stopped speaking of salvation and began preaching about obedience. The congregation didn't understand it, but they trusted him anyway. He always found ways to make his madness sound holy. Meanwhile, Miriam started searching. She crept into his study when he was away. She sifted through locked drawers, opened journals filled with unhinged writing. She found references to ancient texts, to unions between fathers and daughters in spiritual ancestry. He wrote about Leah as if she were more than a daughter, like she was chosen, sacred, his divine part. That night, Miriam sat on the bathroom floor, clutching one of his journals to her chest, unable to breathe. She realized in a moment of terrible clarity that the father of Leah's unborn child was not some stranger in the night. It was Elijah, the pastor, the man she had married, the man the town still trusted with their prayers, a man cloaked in God's name, hiding something monstrous underneath. Miriam Marsh had lived most of her adult life in quiet devotion. She followed her husband's lead, raised her daughter with scripture, and believed in the sanctity of their image. But the truth had shattered that illusion like stained glass beneath a hammer. The journal entries she found in Elijah's study weren't just bizarre, they were terrifying. They didn't sound like the words of a pastor. They sounded like the unraveling thoughts of a man who had rewritten his faith to justify the unforgivable. She didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house made her flinch. She lay in bed beside Elijah, his breathing deep and calm, and wondered how many nights she had unknowingly shared her pillow with a monster. In the morning she tried to go about her routines, making coffee, folding clothes, straightening the living room, but everything felt wrong. Leah barely came out of her room. Her silence wasn't just emotional, it was physical, like she had disappeared into herself completely. Miriam needed help, but she couldn't go to the police, not yet. In Eldridge, Elijah was more than a man, he was a symbol, a figure people trusted more than their own families. Any accusation against him would be met with disbelief, maybe even blame. She couldn't protect Leah alone, but she also couldn't risk speaking to the wrong person. So she turned to Jonas Blake. Jonas had worked alongside Elijah for 4 years, younger, less polished, and far less charismatic. Jonas had always seemed cautious in his admiration of the pastor. He did what he was told but asked more questions than most. Miriam had seen the worry in his eyes before, especially during the last few months when Elijah's sermons had turned strange. She called him late one night, her voice shaking, asking if he could meet her somewhere private. They sat together in the empty fellowship hall of the church, the air heavy and still. Miriam showed him copies of the journal pages. She told him about Leah's pregnancy, the silence, the bruises, and her growing fear that something irreversible had already happened. Jonas didn't speak at first. He stared at the pages, his brow furrowed, trying to process what he was seeing. He had suspected Elijah was hiding something, but nothing like this. This wasn't a secret affair, or a loss of faith. This was a delusion, a sickness, a crime so profound it defied logic. He looked at Miriam and told her the only option now was to get Leah out of the house. That very night, they planned everything carefully. Jonas would bring his car around back after midnight. Miriam would pack only what was necessary. They'd leave quietly, take Leah to a women's shelter in the next town, and speak to authorities from there. They couldn't confront Elijah. They had no idea how far he would go to protect his secret or his power. But what neither of them realized was that they weren't alone that night. Elijah had been listening. Earlier that week, he had installed a baby monitor in Leah's room under the guise of being concerned for her health. He claimed he wanted to make sure she was safe while she rested. In truth, it gave him access to every whispered conversation in the house. And when Miriam and Jonas spoke in the fellowship hall, they forgot that Leah had one of the devices nearby. Elijah had heard everything, the plan, the fear, the betrayal. By the time Jonas left the church that night, Elijah was already in motion. He returned home with calm precision, his face a mask. Miriam was still pretending, still holding on to hope that they could escape without confrontation. But Elijah's mind was no longer grounded in reality. He believed he was doing God's work, that removing the obstacles, his wife, his assistant, anyone who stood in the way of his divine union, was not only necessary, but holy. And Miriam, still clutching her bag, had no idea how close death already stood behind her. The night was quiet, eerily so, the kind of silence that hums in your ears and warns you something is about to happen. Miriam moved with careful steps through the darkened house, every creak in the wooden floor sending a fresh wave of fear through her. Leah was asleep, or at least pretending to be. Her suitcase was packed, hidden beneath her bed, her shoes tucked beneath a loose floorboard in her closet. Miriam had told her earlier in the evening, in the calmest voice she could manage, that they were going on a short trip. No questions, no goodbyes, just escape. Downstairs, the kitchen clock ticked past midnight. Miriam opened the back door and stepped out onto the porch, scanning the driveway. It was empty. Jonas was late. Back inside, Elijah was nowhere to be seen. He had disappeared into his study earlier, and hadn't come out. His absence made Miriam even more uneasy. She stood in the hallway, clutching a flashlight and a small envelope of money she had hidden inside her Bible for emergencies. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought Leah might hear it from her room. Then a soft knock on the front door echoed through the house. She froze. Jonas wasn't supposed to come to the front. That had been the plan. The back door, no lights, no noise. She walked slowly toward the door and peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. A second knock came, louder this time, then silence. Miriam turned, and Elijah was standing behind her. He wasn't angry, not outwardly. He smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. He asked her calmly what she was doing up so late. She said nothing, just shifted her weight and tried to steady her breathing. He tilted his head, as if reading her thoughts, and then stepped closer. That was when she noticed he had Leah's journal in his hand, the one she kept hidden in her room, the one Miriam never even knew he had found. He told her, with that same cold smile, that he understood now, that she had turned their daughter against him, that she had poisoned what was divinely ordained, that she was trying to destroy something sacred. She didn't speak. She didn't have the chance. Elijah moved faster than Miriam thought he was capable of. She stumbled back, falling against the hallway table, the envelope of money scattering across the floor. She screamed for Leah to run, but but her voice was cut off by a sharp blow that sent the world spinning into black. Upstairs, Leah woke to the sound of crashing. For a moment she froze, unsure if it was real or part of a nightmare. Then she heard her father's voice, louder than ever, distorted with rage. She crept out of bed and down the hallway, barefoot and trembling, only to find the stairwell smeared with blood and the front door wide open. She never made it out. The next morning, the house was in flames. The fire department arrived too late. Neighbors had called after seeing smoke rise into the dawn sky. By the time they kicked down the door, the home was fully engulfed. The remains of 3 bodies were found inside. The authorities believed it was a tragic accident, faulty wiring or a gas leak. That was the official report. But Jonas knew better. He had arrived only minutes before the fire was reported. He saw the front door ajar, the faint smell of gasoline in the air. He knew something had gone terribly wrong. He watched the flames consume everything, the house, the evidence, the truth. And in the smoldering ash, only one question remained. Where was Elijah? His body had not been found. Only Miriam and Leah were confirmed dead. Elijah Marsh had vanished, taking his madness and the child Leah had carried with him. The town of Eldridge awoke that morning to a thick wall of smoke rising above the trees and the shrill wail of sirens, echoing across the hills. The Marsh house, once a symbol of calm, faith and family, was now nothing more than smoldering timber and scorched brick. People gathered along the sidewalks in hushed disbelief, watching the fire crews sift through the wreckage. Whispers grew like weeds. First shock, then grief, then confusion. 3 bodies had been found inside, but only 2 were identified. Miriam Marsh and her daughter Leah were confirmed dead. Their remains were burned beyond recognition, but dental records and Leah's recent medical history made identification possible. The 3rd body, so badly damaged it defied simple classification, was initially assumed to be Elijah, but when forensic testing revealed it belonged to a female, and showed no DNA match to Elijah Marsh, everything changed. Elijah wasn't dead, he had vanished. That realization hit Jonas Blake like a fist to the chest. He hadn't slept since the night before, when he arrived at the Marsh home, just moments before the flames erupted. The front door had been open, the hall light flickering strangely, and the air carried a sharp metallic scent. Jonas had reached for his phone to call Miriam, but never had the chance. The fire had ignited fast, swallowing the house before he could take a single step inside. At first he blamed himself. If only he had come sooner, if only he had pushed harder. But now that guilt turned to something colder: suspicion. Elijah was alive and Jonas believed he had faked his own death, sacrificed another woman's body to the flames, and vanished into the shadows like a ghost. It wasn't long before Jonas remembered the voice recorder. He had placed it in the church office weeks earlier. After growing uneasy with Elijah's cryptic behavior, it was hidden behind a stack of hymnals, powered by a long-life battery, and it had recorded every conversation in that room. He retrieved it the day after the fire, his hands trembling, unsure what he would hear. What he found was worse than he imagined. Among the hours of recordings, one segment stood out, dated just 2 days before the fire. It captured Elijah pacing, mumbling to himself. His voice, normally calm and measured, was erratic, drifting between scripture and madness. He spoke of Leah not as his daughter but as his bride. He spoke of a cleansing that had to take place, a sacrifice, a purification. He even mentioned the name of a woman, Rebecca Haynes, who it turned out had been missing from a nearby county for over a week. Her body, Jonas feared, may have been the one burned beyond recognition in the fire to pass as Elijah's. The recordings were turned over to the police. Suddenly the case shifted from accidental fire to intentional murder and disappearance. A statewide manhunt was launched. Elijah's photo was plastered across news broadcasts, gas stations, and post offices. Tips came flooding in, but none led to him. It was as if he had disappeared off the face of the earth. Jonas couldn't shake the unease. He replayed the recordings over and over, haunted by the conviction in Elijah's voice. The former pastor truly believed he was chosen for something divine, that his crimes weren't sins, but sacred rights, that Leah had been his gift from God, and now that same delusional man was out there, somewhere free, dangerous, and entirely unpredictable. The town of Eldridge lived in quiet fear, locking their doors, pulling their children closer and watching every unfamiliar car that passed. They all wondered the same thing: where would he strike next? Jonas feared he already knew, because men like Elijah Marsh didn't run to hide, they ran to finish what they started. 3 days after the fire, the town of Eldridge was still gripped by disbelief. Black wreaths hung from the doors of the church, and candles flickered at the base of the scorched ruins of the Marsh home. The headlines screamed of tragedy, of betrayal of a respected man who had vanished without a trace. But while the town mourned and speculated, Elijah Marsh was already laying the final bricks of his delusion. He had driven through the night after the fire, using backroads and gas stations that didn't ask questions. His face, once clean-shaven and familiar, was now hidden beneath a patchy beard and a faded baseball cap. No one recognized him, and those who did were too unsure to say anything. He left no credit card trail, no phone signal, nothing to track. He had planned this for months, perhaps longer. He settled in a forgotten chapel in the woods, a crumbling structure just outside the border of a neighboring state. It had once been used for summer weddings, but had been abandoned for years. Ivy grew through its broken windows, and the floorboards groaned with every step. But to Elijah it was sacred ground. Inside, he prepared for what he believed was his final ceremony. The chapel was filled with strange items. Dozens of candles lined the altar. Framed photographs of Leah smiling, sleeping, laughing as a child were placed carefully around the pulpit. A white veil had been hung over the cross. On the piano bench lay a wedding dress, wrinkled and yellowed with age. He had taken it from Miriam's closet the night before the fire. He spent those 3 days decorating the space in eerie silence. He hummed hymns as he worked, speaking only to Leah's photograph, calling her my queen, my chosen, and the vessel of our covenant. He believed her spirit had survived, that she had transcended death, and would return to him for a union blessed by God himself. The final piece of his twisted vision came in the form of a ceremony. On the third night, Elijah dressed in a tuxedo he had worn to a church wedding years ago. It no longer fit quite right, the collar tight, the sleeves short, but he didn't seem to notice. He lit the candles one by one, placed the photo of Leah on the altar, and opened a Bible that had been torn apart and rewritten with his own notes in the margins. He began to speak aloud, his voice rising and falling, like he was preaching to a congregation that wasn't there. He read vows. He recited verses he had altered to suit his madness. He spoke of eternity, of fire and renewal, of a union that would eclipse flesh and blood. Outside, a farmer returning home late heard the strange echoes of organ music coming from the chapel. At first, he assumed teenagers were playing a prank, but when he saw the flickering lights and heard the low chant-like murmurs, something told him to call the authorities. By the time law enforcement arrived, the scene was silent again. The candles were still burning. The chapel was eerily still. Officers stepped carefully inside, their flashlights casting shadows that danced along the cracked walls. Then they saw him. Elijah was lying in front of the altar, the photograph of Leah pressed to his chest, his lips stained a dark blue. A small glass vial rested beside him, empty. Poison. He had ended his life after completing his wedding. There was no struggle, no note, just a final journal opened beside him, with one line scribbled across the page: "We are one in spirit. The world cannot understand what is divine." He died believing it. Elijah Marsh's reign of control, manipulation, and horror ended not with justice, but with delusion. And though he was gone, the terror he left behind would never fully disappear. The death of Elijah Marsh brought a strange kind of silence to Eldridge. It wasn't peace, it was hollow, like the breath held in a room that had just stopped burning. Word of his suicide traveled quickly, spreading through the town like a second fire. Some refused to believe it, others wished they had never known the truth. There were no vigils for Elijah, no services, no flowers placed at the chapel where he was found. His body was quietly claimed by the state, cremated and forgotten by most, at least publicly. But the damage he caused ran deeper than ashes. The church, once the town's anchor, stood empty. Its stained glass windows had lost their glow. No one rang the bell. The pews gathered dust, and the pulpit remained untouched. At first, there was talk of reopening with Jonas Blake as the new pastor. Some even suggested a rededication ceremony, a way to take back the sanctuary from Elijah's shadow. But every time Jonas tried to gather people, attendance shrank. Some couldn't look at the altar without hearing Elijah's voice. Others simply lost their faith entirely. For them, if a man like that could preach for decades undetected, then what did any of it mean? The town's families grew quieter. Children asked fewer questions. Neighbors no longer waved from their porches. The house that had once belonged to the Marsh family was leveled within weeks. No buyer wanted it, not even for the land. The ground itself felt cursed. They brought in machines and tore it down in a single day, but even after the rubble was gone, no one built anything in its place. It remained an empty lot, overgrown with weeds, guarded by an iron fence no one ever touched. Jonas tried to hold things together. He organized counseling sessions, led grief groups, and even reopened the church office briefly to help families heal. But healing never truly began. Everyone who had admired Elijah now lived with shame. The same man they trusted to marry their children, bury their dead, and shape their beliefs had been living a nightmare behind his front door. Some townspeople whispered that Miriam should have said something earlier. Others wondered if Leah had tried and been silent. A few even believed Elijah's final writings, twisted as they were, and saw him as a misunderstood prophet. These people didn't speak loudly, but they existed, always on the fringes, clinging to the idea that what happened wasn't as evil as it seemed. Jonas knew better. He had read the transcripts, listened to the recordings. There was no interpretation, no divine mission, only control, abuse and madness. Still, Jonas couldn't let go. He kept a single light burning in the old church office and visited it every night. He would sit at the desk, flipping through Leah's school books, old church bulletins, and the one surviving Bible Miriam had marked in the margins. It was his way of remembering, not Elijah, but the ones lost because of him. Miriam, who tried to protect her daughter. Leah, who never got to live her life. Even Rebecca Haynes, the woman whose body was used in the fire, now buried in an unmarked grave far from her home. But the worst part was the silence. Jonas once believed that time could heal anything, that truth could restore what was broken. But some truths are too heavy, and in Eldridge the air never quite cleared. People moved on, but they looked over their shoulders more often. They triple-checked their doors. They hesitated before trusting anyone too much, even those in robes behind pulpit. Because the monster they had feared wasn't one that came out at night. He had stood beside them, every Sunday in plain sight, and they had all clapped, prayed, and called him pastor. It had been nearly 6 months since Elijah Marsh was found dead in the abandoned chapel, clutching a photograph of Leah and a journal filled with delusion. Eldridge had begun to settle into a fragile quiet, the kind that comes after a long storm. People still avoided the empty church. Children still whispered ghost stories about the Marsh house lot, but the headlines faded. Life, as it always does, pressed forward, though never quite the same. Then one rainy afternoon, a small package arrived at Jonas Blake's office. There was no return address. The handwriting on the envelope was jagged and uneven, almost childlike. Inside was a thick, leather-bound journal, the same kind Elijah had used for his sermon notes. Jonas opened it carefully, each page yellowed, the edges burned at the corners as if it had been rescued from fire. But this wasn't a sermon book, it was something far darker. This was Elijah Marsh's final diary. The entries began 6 weeks before the fire. They started innocently, notes on scripture, thoughts on upcoming services, but slowly shifted into something else. Paragraphs about Leah appeared more frequently, her name circled and underlined, surrounded by rambling references to purity, destiny and divine selection. As Jonas read, his stomach turned. Elijah had documented every step of his descent. His belief that Leah was not just his daughter, but a chosen vessel, the mother of a new covenant. He wrote about dreams where angels spoke to him in Leah's voice, about visions of fire and blood and rebirth. He described Miriam as a corrupting force, and Jonas as a traitor dressed as a lamb. He even detailed how he had tracked down Rebecca Haynes, the woman whose body he had burned in his place. He called her a necessary substitute, noting how she fulfilled the prophecy without even knowing it. Jonas read through every page, each one darker than the last. There were no expressions of guilt, no doubt. Elijah hadn't believed he was doing anything wrong. He had written with confidence, with the certainty of a man who thought he was walking in the footsteps of saints. But one entry stood out. It was dated the night before the fire, and it was the longest of them all. In it Elijah described watching Leah sleep for what he believed would be the final time. He wrote of feeling both like a father and a groom, a line that made Jonas nearly drop the book. He spoke of her silence as a sign of agreement, her stillness as consent. There was no remorse, no recognition of horror, only pride. The final page was written in a different hand, shakier, uneven, almost rushed. It was scrawled with phrases that made little sense at first. Ashes rise, wedding in the flame, we are eternal. And then at the very bottom, one last line, I did what was divine, the world just wasn't ready. Jonas sat in silence, the book heavy in his lap. It wasn't just a diary, it was evidence. It was madness inked in scripture, and it confirmed every fear he had tried to bury since the day Miriam whispered her suspicions. He turned the envelope over again, wondering who had sent it. A part of him believed Elijah had arranged for its delivery before his death, ensuring someone would read his final word. But there was another possibility, one that chilled Jonas more than he cared to admit. Someone else had found it, someone who believed in it. Jonas locked the diary in a drawer and stared out the rain-soaked window. Outside, the streets of Eldridge looked calm, children played in yards. Life continued, but beneath the surface, something dark remained. A seed planted in whispers, in journals, in blood. And even though Elijah Marsh was dead, Jonas knew one thing for certain: evil doesn't die, it waits.